Hello, guys, and warm welcome to the first roundtable. Warm welcome to the first roundtable of this of the Nickel and Dime, and we are the IR cluster. And today, I have the panelists that is Swapnil and Raymond, and the conference will be moderated by myself, Sashank, as well as Malik. So today we'll be talking about a very pertinent issue in the era of geopolitics, and that is as India takes the presidency in G20. But to elaborate on that, I'll pass over the mic to Malik so that he can carry forward the discussion.
All right. Well, welcome everyone. So, as we know, the G20 presidency, which India took the helm of last year, it has been seen in a very it has been seen as very pivotal for the global politics from this year forward, and it has been seen as a transfer of power to India. It's taking helm at such an important position. G20 is taking more importance in the recent years as the economies of the global south rise, in opposition to, let's say, G7, which was the predominant power till now. So finally, with the presidency passing to India and now the summit being held in India, a lot of questions do arise. But before we delve into that, let me just ask a simple question. And Shashank, we can just start with you. What do you think? What makes India's presidency at the G20 a pivotal event for the nation's foreign policy? What does India plan to do throughout its tenure as a G20 president in terms of values and actions? What do you think is the significance of this?
I think I'll take on the second part of the question first and then come to the first part. I think, as the Prime Minister said when he took the gavel in Bali as well, they are planning. India's agenda is really to be action oriented, decisive, and inclusive and ambitious. That's what they said. And that kind of stems in from what you said before. It was before the G7 that was the predominant group. But once they saw that the G7 weren't able to deliver their promises, and a lot of developing countries were now starting to assert their dominance as well, it was seen as if no, you need a cooperation that was on a much more global scale than the G7. And that's what the Prime Minister also says when he said it was inclusive and ambitious and not just limited to this small cohort of developed countries. Rather, we need to include the developing countries, and especially in various aspects of the climate change. You need a wide ranging consensus. So I think that's the agenda. And then moving on to the first question, it's the pivotal moment because we see that there has been a revival of some sort in Indian diplomacy and Indian foreign policy in the past 2 years or so. We are becoming more assertive from the Nehruan idea of non-alignment. Now we are becoming more of pro-India. It's still not aligned with anybody, but we are becoming more assertive in kind of voicing out our concerns and our issues. So in that's how you need to kind of see the impact and the influence that India wields as the president of the G20. Probably we have always been, say, advocates of the global south, and that's what even the finance minister said. They want to be the voice of the global south. So it's very clear that they want to steer the conversation towards global south and towards developing countries, and carry forward the discussion further from their point of view as well.
So that seems like the obvious course forward. It seems India is also voicing the concern of a lot of the global which do not want to fall into bloc politics, which seems to be emerging in the world today. We can move to another question, which says that how can India's presidency be situated in the wider milieu of its role as a rising global leader? Swapnil, this seems to be the perfect question for you.
Yeah. So, like Shashank mentioned, India is obviously leaning towards global south. And one thing that we can observe is that as the president of the G20, India was entitled to invite several observer states and non-member states to attend the deliberations of the conference. And in India's case, these countries include Nigeria, Oman, Qatar, UAE, Mauritius even. So these, are countries which are clearly not considered part of the traditional centers of power. They are part of the global South, Afro-Asian countries, and particularly the Middle Eastern countries that we mentioned. Can you just give me one second? Yeah, so sorry about that. Particularly the Middle Eastern countries, as we can see, they assume greater importance in the context of the energy crisis caused by the Ukraine conflict. So it would make sense that India is trying to build stronger ties with these nations.
I'll just try to.
Shansh, would you like to present?
Yeah, I'll just try to just add on to the Swapnil's point as well. And apart from kind of steering the conversation towards the global South as well, I think what India feels itself is that it wants to really act as a bridge between the developing countries and the developed countries, and so it wants to use this unique position. Right now we are having good relations with the US, with Europe, with the FTAs coming in. I think it'll be an improved relation, so that's there as well. At the same time, we are having some good relations with the developing countries as well. So I think, as with India becoming the president, it wants to kind of act as this bridge, as I said. And the and one of the most important way to do that, they feel, is to bring in some reforms in the multilateral institutions, which a lot of developing countries feel it is somewhat biased against them, or somewhat discriminatory in, WTO rules are somewhat discriminatory towards the developing countries, and so they want to bring in these. And with COVID as well as the Russian war, there has been some sort of this consensus that these multilateral institutions have failed, including the UN, and you need to bring in some reforms to make them more adept at solving some of the world's crises, including climate change and security, energy prices, and those things like that. So I feel one of the most important agenda that India would like to have and is to bring in some reforms in the multilateral institutions, bring in some more funding, especially towards the global South, and steer that towards them to kind of fight their own problems. So yes, I think reforms in the multilateral institutions is one important aspect.
So, as the New Delhi assumes its tenure of the presidency at G20, how do you think it will deal with the multidimensional crisis that came to head in Bali Summit in 2022? We all know how awkward things were going to be with the Russian foreign minister going there, and with the Indian Prime Minister and Chinese Premier, Chinese General Secretary of Communist Party meeting there. A lot of things going on at the same times. Now, with India assuming the presidency, how do you think they will navigate all of this? Anyone can jump in.
Right, so I guess I would have some observations on that. So if we actually look at the list of multidimensional crises which the Bali Summit deliberated on, I think two big ones were food security and energy security, which was specifically mentioned by the Prime Minister as well. That something which India needs to tackle particularly. He mentioned the global fertilizer shortage, which has been caused by the Ukraine war, because Ukraine and Russia were major exporters of fertilizers, and so now Ukraine is in a conflict scenario where Russia has been sanctioned, so it can't export them. And he said that this is something which can very easily become a global food crisis in the near future. And what the Prime Minister suggested were that countries should build mutual agreements to ensure that there is a stable supply chains for both food grains and fertilizers. And he mentioned that India specifically was taking steps to make its agriculture renewable and sustainable. He talked about, how the government is promoting natural farming, and it's repopularizing traditional grains like millets. And then on the energy security frontier as well, like I mentioned earlier, the Ukraine conflict has caused a global energy crisis. India being a developing economy, we need to ensure that our energy reserves are quite stable and not uninterrupted. So he mentioned that obviously the answer is renewables. He promised that by 2030, India will be producing half of its electricity actually from renewable sources. And another important factor in this context is that, India is the leader of the International Solar Alliance, right? Since 2015, when the Prime Minister founded it, it's even headquartered in Gurgaon. So India has always, I think, or in the recent past, it has always laid a heavy emphasis on solar energy and renewable energy.
Lastly, given the proposed location of G20 summit in this year, how is geopolitics, in your opinion, embedded itself into the core agenda and functioning of international forums such as the G20 or the World Economic Forum? Any ideas on that? Raymond, any ideas on that?
You are not audible. Yeah, you're not audible. Uh, in the meanwhile, I just have a
Yeah.
small point. I think by keeping the meetings in places like Jammu Kashmir, I'm not able to articulate it properly, but it's like going right into the lion's den and then keeping it over there. So it's kind of like that. That's what the Indian government is doing. It's in a way, you're just trying to show flex your muscles here in a bit, like because the JNK problem has been a global issue and always, and even the world leaders, they are like, well, let us intervene and all those stuff, and India has been very against it. And now, when you are keeping in a conference or a meeting of a level of importance like the G20, and where you invite all the world leaders and keeping it in Kashmir, it's kind of an opportunity for the Indian government to kind of show its progress that it has made there, and then see it's not as bad as you think. Like, we are the good side. Look what's happening on that side, and it's kind of like that. They want to kind of portray JK as a very stable, as a relatively stable rather, area for conferences, and it's not all about the terrorism, and all it's not all about the problems with Pakistan and China. So in a way, it wants to use this platform and the presidency that it has got in it. It of course doesn't have any formal powers, but it wants to use these influences that India has over the presidency to steer the conversation towards the aspects, including the geopolitical aspect as well, by keeping it in JNK and by telling it is like, look, come and invest here. It's not as bad as you think it is. So yes, I think that's the main agenda here.
Any other thoughts on that?
Just adding on to what Shashank said, one of the key leaders who will be attending the G20 summit is obviously Xi Jinping of China. And just in the very recent past, we have seen India and China having border clashes along the LAC and along our border regions. So I think in the context of the rising India-China tensions and even USA-China tensions, this was something mentioned as a multidimensional crisis at the Bali Summit, kind of bringing world leaders to Kashmir and showing them that, yeah, Kashmir is developing, is prospering under Indian rule, is also a kind of way of generating support against the Chinese threat. Because obviously, India might want to generate a perception of China as this authoritarian regime, which is trying to kind of aggressively expand its territories. And well, it's in the Kashmir region particularly, China's already annexed a portion of that in Aksai Chin and might want to further expand its territories.
No, I mean, that seems to be the signal it's sending by holding the summit in these locations. I think that wraps it up. We have had quite some insights from this. We can safely say that, first of all, India wants to lead the global south now. It wants to be seen there, not allied with any other camp, but where its own interests and the interests of the global south, they sort of intersect. It's from the very passive sense of non-alignment, which it earlier used to carry out. Now the foreign policy is much more aggressive, and the G20 seems like a perfect platform to take that forward. And obviously, dealing with the multi-dimensional crisis, G20 seems like the better forum than others because these countries are more affected. The second-tier countries, you can say, more than the first ones, which do have the financial wherewithal to sort of go through the crisis. And lastly, the signaling which is being intended by holding the summit in certain locations is clear for everyone to see. And this is also India sort of flexing his muscles, as Shashank pointed out, because it can afford to do so at this point. And this summit seems like the perfect time to do it. Any last thoughts on India's G20 presidency and where it will go?
I think like at this very tumultuous time, like 2022, wherein you had the war, of course, then which resulted in the energy and the food crisis as well. Before that, you had the COVID. I think with Indian presidency, what they're trying to really tell is, stop politicizing these issues, like stop politicizing global supply of food, of fertilizers, importantly, of fertilizers and medicine and supplies. And so I think that's where I think that's one of the most pivotal points of the presidency, wherein even during the pandemic, India was against this patency of the vaccines, and which said that as a result of which you wouldn't be able to, deliver vaccines to the poorer people. So I think those kind of reforms, which kind of try to remove the politics away from these basic humanitarian needs and crises, that would be the most challenging part for India, especially in this time when the word globalization itself has now slightly become outdated, and everybody's trying to serve their own interests. So in such a time when you have to forge in all these interests and try to tell, what, stop depoliticizing when the entire world is in kind of this political turmoil, that would be quite a challenge, and it will be interesting to see how it progresses further.
Swapnil, any thoughts on that, or Raymond?
Yeah, I think Shashank summed things up quite well. I would just state that the G20 in general has always been an important forum where world leaders, even in opposing geopolitical camps, can kind of meet and exchange views. We saw it this year itself with President Biden and Premier Xi Jinping coming together and trying to resolve some of their disputes over trade wars or Taiwan. Or even the President Putin didn't attend the meeting, which he's had the Russian representative and Foreign Minister Lavrov. So I hope India can, and I think India will seek to try to continue to mediate international disputes through the forum of the G20, because India, has always not really toed to a particular line or leaned towards one particular geopolitical bloc, but tried to steer the middle course. And I think it's to try to continue that by mediating these disputes.
That is where this seems to be headed. Thank you all of you for having this session. This was very insightful, very informative. I thank you, Shashank, Swapnil, and Raymond for attending this session, and all of the viewers. We'll see you all next time. Take care.